Thank you all for coming tonight. Welcome to the Raleigh Write to Publish Group's monthly event. I am Stacey Cochran, an organizer for the Raleigh Write to Publish Group, and we have an outstanding author guest joining us all the way from Charlotte, North Carolina with her debut novel. I've got a bio here that I had copy and pasted from somewhere, so let me read this. Kim Wright has been writing about travel, food, and wine for more than 20 years. Her writing has appeared in many magazines, including Wine Spectator, Self, Travel and Leisure, and Vogue, and she has twice won the Lowell Thomas Award for travel writing. She does live in Charlotte. So thank you very much for joining us here, Kim. How about a round of applause for our special guest author tonight? Well, you've been writing professionally for a long time.
Yes.
So what was the motivation, the inspiration to say, I want to write a novel? Was Love in Midair your first novel that you'd written? Tell us about the inspiration for it.
The first novel I published. But I think I'm like everybody else. For every novel that you've written, you've got 3 or 4 kind of half-written novels that are in a drawer somewhere. If I need to pull it closer. Okay. You guys can hear me, can't you? Or can you hear me okay back in the back? But yeah, it is my first novel. I've worked as a nonfiction writer and actually had taught nonfiction. I teach nonfiction as an adjunct faculty member at the Queen's MFA program in Charlotte. And it's kind of weird because I was always one of those people that said, you know, you should definitely write nonfiction. Even if you consider yourself a poet, a novelist, a short story writer, most of what's published is nonfiction. You're just trying to hit a bigger bullseye. The odds of getting published are just greater in nonfiction. I mean, if you did an aerial view of this store, you know, there's a lot of nonfiction versus fiction, and that's true for any bookstore in the country. So it's kind of funny that, you know, after I, you know, kind of being the evangelist for nonfiction, I'm kind of like, I think I've got a novel in me. And this is the first one that I've actually gotten published, but I've got 2 or 3 kind of, you know, half-written, you know, embryonic baby novels stuck away somewhere.
So what was it about Love in Midair that drove you to complete it? I know we've got, how many folks have a book sort of partially completed but not completely done yet? So we've got a bunch of folks who have those
I think
books
we
in
could
that
go out in the
embryonic
parking
state.
lot and probably find just that many people.
Yeah,
too.
probably a few more of them.
I think everybody's got a half-finished novel somewhere. Actually, I originally thought of Love in Midair as a nonfiction book. And kind of the genesis of it was when I got divorced 15 years ago, I always kept journals, but all of a sudden a very weird thing happened. I became the person it was like okay to talk to. So I'd be like in the Harris Teeter or something, and people would come up to me and just like start telling me their stories, just in this compulsive way, the way that when you're pregnant people tell you their stories, just that kind of compulsive way. And it was like I had become the person who had publicly failed. I was okay to talk to. I became the mother confessor of every discontented woman in Charlotte. There were more of them than you would have guessed. And I became the person who heard all their stories. And like I said, I kept journals. I wrote all the stories down. It became journal after journal after journal to an embarrassing point. And I was literally I put them all in a big, hefty trash bag, one of the leaf kind with the, you know, things where you can close it. And pretty soon I had literally a hefty trash bag full of the stories of the discontented women of Charlotte, North Carolina.
So you knew there would be an audience for that.
I knew there'd be an audience, and I also sort of felt that I was onto something because at the same time, my mediator had told me that 65% of divorces are initiated by women, which is not something that's discussed very often, and that the older the woman was, the more likely she was to be the one who initiated the divorce. So I thought, well, that's interesting. It's never talked about. It's never discussed. Why is divorce always presented in, you know, the way that the man has walked out on the woman? Who are all these women that are initiating? Where are their stories? I thought about doing it in a more essayist nonfiction, and then knew I was too close to it, so I put it away for 2 years. And when I pulled it back out, for the first time I was like, maybe it's a novel. Maybe it's not nonfiction. Maybe it's a novel.
So it sounds like there were 2 things going on. One, you had gone through your own divorce, and so it was a way of sort of processing that and maybe in a safe way in fiction. But then the second part of it was you realized, oh, there's an audience for this story.
Yeah.
And those 2 things really
I definitely realized there was an audience. I was actually, at that time, I was in a book club, and I started looking for books about divorce, you know, for our own book club to read, and I just wasn't finding anything that struck me as being realistic or you know, they always, like I said, they were very formulaic, I felt like. They didn't deal with the fact what would make a woman initiate. They didn't deal with the fact her friends are going to be impacted. I mean, the whole social circle, it radiates out. So I thought, okay, I want to write a book that not only deals with the woman, the husband, you know, the child, but that goes into the whole social structure that begins to unravel, you know, when a divorce happens in the middle of a social set.
Well, I latch onto the word realism in that answer. The protagonist in this book, Elise, is that how you pronounce her name? Elise. Maybe as a way of answering this question, you can give folks a little bit of a background on the story. The question is Elise a sympathetic character? What are some of the choices that she makes early in the novel? I'm sure she's sympathetic to you. How do you perceive readers' responses to her as a sympathetic character, and then maybe a little bit about the story itself?
Well, they've been all over the board. Basically, in the first reader responses have been, in the first manifestation, I wrote the book and it covered a 3-year time span. And I started with Elise being unhappy, leaving her husband, living as a single woman, and then meeting a man. After I put the notebooks down for 2 years and picked them back up, one of the things I saw was I was going to have to compress it. The book was just meandering all over the place. I had like 17 characters. It covered 3 years. It was just your classic, you know, first novel. I threw in everything, you know. I mean, it was very out of control, very unfocused. And I thought, okay, I'm going to compress it and push it to 9 months and cut 17 characters to 9. And to be honest with you, I don't think I would have had the guts to make such a slash of the manuscript if I hadn't put it down for a long time first. But to answer your question about sympathetic, I realized when I compressed it, and now she meets the lover in the first paragraph. So she has an affair while married, and I thought, okay, I'm really risking making her an unsympathetic character. And really weighed in my mind, is it worth making her an unsympathetic character or a potentially unsympathetic character in order to have more dramatic tension? So I opted, obviously, for the dramatic tension. And I do think that some people, you know, there's obviously going to be people who inherently find that choice unsympathetic. She's also very impulsive, which was another decision that I made, and I decided to write the book in present tense. I wanted to show somebody, I call it driving through crazy town. I think when you get divorced, I think that you can be the most sane, well-adjusted person in the world, and you get divorced and you find yourself doing things you didn't think you'd do. And I just, you know, I see her as a normal person who's just, you know, she's under so much pressure, she's kind of driving through crazy town. And, you know, so yes, she makes some very impulsive choices. I opted to tell the story in present tense so that I could show her literally in the moment of making these risky, bad choices. I thought, even if I've got her, you know, 70 years old, she's sitting on the porch and she's thinking back of when she was 40, you'll know she made it. There's something about the past tense or the looking back that will make you less worried for her. So I opted to not only make it first person but present tense, kind of in a way, I think, to make someone who could be an unsympathetic character a little more sympathetic, or at least make you worry about her more.
Quick show of hands, how many folks have driven through Crazy Town themselves? Anybody? A couple people?
Oh, good. Got real estate, huh? Stopped and bought.
She's selling real estate, I think.
I'm selling it. It keeps coming back like a bad penny.
There you go. So how long did it take to write Love in Midair?
I hate that question. It seems like such an obvious question, but it's really hard because I twice put it down for 2 years or longer. So do you count those 2 years?
I think you have to.
Then it took about 10.
Wow.
If you don't count those 2, I actually worked on it for 5. You know, put it down for 2, picked it up, put it down for, you know, and then it's been, my publisher has held it for 2 years and 3 months. So there's been lots of gaps in this story. And one of the things I would not have believed, if someone had sat here and told this to me 10 years ago, I would not have believed this. But the gaps improved the story. The fact that I took these sabbaticals from it and put it down and came back, I think, not only improved the story, but improved my ability to be kind of impartial about the story. It began to look like something someone else had written. And now, even the last one, when they told me that they were going to wait 2 years and 3 months to publish it, I almost had a coronary. I was so disappointed. But even that, in a weird way, has kind of paid off. Because, number one, I don't think I missed anything sitting out the last 2 years economic markets, and it gave me a chance to start working on the sequel. But most of all, I feel detached from it in a way that I think if I had just finished it and sent it off, and they, you know, it was one of those they rushed through, it really seems to me now, I think of it, I always call it my first book, not my book. And I'm not sure I could have done that 2 years ago.
I've got to think if you take a break like 2 years or long breaks, that you come to it more mature, having experienced life a little bit more, thinking about the character in a different way. What is it that you that those breaks do to improve the writing? Do you see it more objectively, I'm sure?
Yeah. When I was still working on it, the breaks made me pick it up and see immediately what was wrong with it. And what was wrong with it in a big structural way. I think the problem when you're dealing with something day after day after day is you might think, oh, that paragraph doesn't work. That's the wrong word choice. But you don't see it like, I've got to rip out the first 100 pages. I think like these big structural, like I said, slash and burn revisions usually follow times that the author stepped away from the book. I just think it takes nerves of steel to be able to revise like that. You know, revision in the sense of revision, see it again. I think you almost always have to have a break to make that kind of revision.
I'm coming around to the realization myself as a writer. I think that for folks who write, you know, the New York Times best-selling like mystery or crime or even romance novels, and they crank these novels out one per year, I'm coming around to the realization that you can maybe do that for plot-driven novels, but for a character-driven novel,
Right.
It's just impossible because you have to grow with the character. And you can't do that in 6 months, you know.
You can't. I'm in kind of a thing now because I'm talking to my my agent and my editor, and they're like, I'm doing plot treatments of 2 new books that I hope will be my second and third novel. And they're like, get us the first 4 chapters of these 2 books. Well, you may as well tell me, you know, to build a car from scratch. It's just, I don't write in sequence. I tend to write out of sequence. You know, the next to last chapter of this book was the first one I literally wrote. I wrote backwards. I knew she was falling, but I didn't know why. And I tend to write backwards. So the first 4 chapters for me are often the very last thing I get. And I think it's because, you know, I do write more thematically, more character-driven. And, you know, in a way, I kind of admire the people that can just sit down and, you know, they have an outline and they just march through it. But I think it's hard to do a literary book that way because they're more organic. They seem to grow out of key scenes. And I think I've talked to some writers now that they are like, it's scene-driven. You know, you find the really key scenes, and then it emerges out from that. It's not linear. It's more of an unfolding or a, you know, spreading out type.
So the author, again, is Kim Wright. The book is Love in Midair. The format for this evening's event, I've got a few questions, obviously. I'd like for Kim to do a reading now. I've got a few more questions after that, and then let's open it up to you guys, and let's have the time to answer everybody's questions if you have questions about how to publish a book or that sort of thing. So would you like to read a section from
Sure.
Love in
I'd like
Midair?
to read out my own book because I actually have, right, thank you, Lee. And my glasses. My daughter knows I'm blind, prone to coughing, and so anal I have to read out of my own special little book. Thank you. This is actually from the first chapter, and Elise is your classic. It's really kind of funny. One of the things, the book is set in Charlotte. I live in Charlotte. That's risky. You know, like I said, I had this, you know, sack of stories that I came and dismantled and put back together and amalgamated that, you know, became the book. So it's kind of a funny thing to, you know, write a book that's set in your hometown and to feel that sense of kind of exposure with this. But in this part of the thing, Elise is a unhappily married woman. She is not a desperately unhappily married woman. She's a bubblingly discontented woman. And she's on a flight, page 4. She's flying back. She's a potter from a pottery show. And she sits down beside an attractive man on the airplane. And this is really going to be life-changing for her. I crawl over the guy in 29C and drop into my seat, thinking that this is one of those times that you regret trying to do the right thing, only I'm wrong. This is one of those times that karma turns around faster than a boomerang. The man sitting beside me in 29E says, "That was a nice thing to do." He's tall, so tall that he's turned slightly in his seat, his knees just on the edge of my space. I asked him why he was in Arizona, and he says he was on a climb. He's an investment banker. He climbs mountains on weekends. He doesn't like to fly. He turns slightly more towards me in his seat, and I turn slightly more towards him. I tell him that it seems strange that a person that can climb mountains is afraid to fly, and he shakes his head. It's a matter of control, he says, and he tells me about the scariest thing that's ever happened to him on a climb. Years ago, when he'd just begun the sport, he found himself linked to a guy who didn't fix the clips right, and something broke loose, and both of them slid. There's nothing worse, he says, than to be halfway up the face of the mountain, past the turnback point, and all of a sudden you realize you can't count on the other person. I ask him what the turnback point is, and he says there's a place you get to in every climb where it's just as dangerous to retreat as it is to advance. I nod. It seems like I should have known this. He asks me if I'm married, and I say yes, 9 years. 9, he says, slowly, as if the number in itself has this kind of power. 9 is sort of in the middle. I don't feel like I'm in the middle of my marriage, but I don't feel like I'm at the beginning or the end of it either. I find marriage immeasurable, oceanic. The man in 29C has put on his headphones. We have our vodka and pretzels by now. It's such a funny sport, he says. It takes me a minute to realize what he's even talking about. Each time I summit, I think the same thing, that we shouldn't have come here, that human beings have no business being in the sky. Every time I think, this will be my last climb, but then I get home and in a couple of weeks I want to do it again. I guess once you start, it's hard to stop, I say. I've never met anyone who used the word summit as a verb. But he has shut his eyes and leaned back in his seat as if just telling the story has exhausted him. I pull the Red Book magazine from my bag, and the cover says 48 Things to Do to a Man in Bed. I bought the magazine just for this article. Defying all logic, there's still a part of me that thinks I can save my marriage through sex. Jerry, his name is Jerry, opens his eyes and begins to read over my shoulder. His Bennett-long nap seems to have revitalized him, because he suggests we go through the list and each write down 3 things we'd like to try. Wouldn't it be something if they were the same 3 things? I strongly suspect they will be the same 3 things. He's married too, of course. He's married to somebody he met in the drop ad line his freshman year at UMass. At one point they'd been together so long they just looked at each other and said, why not? 2 boys and then a girl, and the daughter especially. She's the love of his life, he says, but his wife, that's a whole nother issue. He's pressed his thigh against mine, opened his legs as if I'm a weight he must push away in order to make himself stronger. Marriage is difficult, I tell him. It's the only thing in my whole life I've ever failed at. I've never said this to anyone, never used the word failed, but it rolls off my tongue like a fact. Maybe this is just the way you should always confess things, just like this, in midair, and to a total stranger. I wait for him to convince me that it isn't true. God knows if I tried to say this back home, 100 people would rush in to correct me before the words were even out of my mouth. They would say it's just the vodka talking, or the altitude, or maybe my desire to intrigue this man by saying something dramatic, anything that will keep him turned towards me in his seat. Any marriage can be salvaged, my friends tell me, especially a clean, well-ordered little one like mine. No, of course I haven't failed. We're just going through a rough spot. But this man doesn't correct me. He is smiling as he screws the top off his second bottle of vodka. His hands are very beautiful, and I need for a man to have beautiful hands. Hands that can make you feel a little breathless, even as they go through the most mundane of tasks, even as they rip open a package of pretzels, or reach up to redirect the flow of air. The list, he says, pointing towards the magazine. Do you have paper? He digs something out of his pocket. You can type it into my BlackBerry. I'm supposed to type 3 things I want to do in bed into your BlackBerry? Are you going to delete it? He smiles. Eventually. The flight goes fast. When the pilot comes on to say we're beginning our descent into Dallas, it startles me so much it's like I've forgotten I was even on a plane. Can I hold your hand, Jerry asked me. This is the part he hates, the landing. This is the part where you're statistically most likely to crash. And he explains that this is true for climbers too, that most of them are killed on the way down. He smiles again as he tells me this, flashing strong white teeth. I have visions of him ripping flesh from bone. Good teeth and good hands. He's a type, of course. He's a player. He's the kind of man who meets a woman at 30,000 feet and persuades her to type her fantasies into his BlackBerry. But for some reason, I don't care. He asks me how long I'll be laid over in Dallas. Almost 2 hours, I say. He thinks maybe we should have a drink. There's definitely time for a drink, at least a drink. He says he's a little lightheaded, too, the result of the climb. It's all been so strange, such an intense day. He changed planes at the last minute. He wasn't even supposed to be sitting in this seat, he says, and maybe he needs something to press him back into himself. This is probably all quite meaningless. He's probably the sort of man who does this all the time. People meet in planes and do it all the time, huddled under thin airline blankets or those cheap hotels that offer shuttle service from the terminals. It's an in-flight flirtation, nothing special, and I shouldn't even been talking to him. I have not had sex with any man other than my husband in 9 years. I suppose we could have a drink, I say. Oh, I'll keep this. It's my book.
Okay. So Kim Wright, the author of Love in Midair. A couple of questions come to mind as I was hearing you read. You mentioned earlier that you wrote that well after you had written a lot of the rest of the novel. I want to ask about the style of writing in present tense, but first, what did you know about the character at the point that you went back and wrote that scene that informed that scene the way that you wrote it?
Well, the main thing I knew was that she was going to fall. Like I said, I had this first chapter in which she's literally falling through space. So I'm kind of like, well, why is this person falling through space? Who's this person? Why are they falling? And I developed just a lot of the things about her from that image. I made her a cheerleader, a girl who was on an elite squad where they throw girls in the air and catch them, but that she was afraid to be a flyer, to be one of the girls that's thrown. She was always one of the ones who caught people. So I wanted to set her up as someone who was afraid to let go and fall, who was always hanging on. And then I got the idea that this lover should be somehow also connected to this theme of rising and falling. And I thought, well, he'll be a mountain climber, and he's going to, ironically, teach her how to safely climb. And I thought, well, it'd be interesting if she's afraid to go up, but he's afraid to come down. So I and then I thought, well, then they should meet on a plane. So I mean, that's kind of the way my process. Ergo, in the first chapter, we're on a plane, but my process is very backward. That they needed to both have height-related issues, sort of, and then I thought, well, they'll meet on a plane. That's a
It works to
logical place for them to
comedic
meet.
effect very, very well because you have the interplay of her, not really, or is it him that doesn't like to fly or her?
He doesn't like to fly. He's afraid to.
And at the same time, he's talking about mountain climbing and this point of no return and falling, and I think they work really, really well together in that scene. The dialogue with what's actually going on in the scene, of course, and then there's the whole metaphor of it, being related to their relationship and a relationship in general.
I have to tell you two things that are kind of funny about that scene. My son is 21. He's in college, and he actually, when he read the first chapter of the book, I really wasn't sure how he was going to take it. He's 21. He's in college. And he said, I got to tell you. He said, I love the foreshadowing when she doesn't like to climb and he's afraid to descend. He's going to bail on her. He's not going to be there in the end, right? And I'm like, good, George. I couldn't believe you picked that up. So it's pretty heavy foreshadowing. They kind of tell the whole story of their relationship in that little moment that they talk about, what part of the journey scares them. And then also there's when they have their big kiss at the end of the chapter before they go their separate ways and get on their separate planes, they're in the Travelers Chapel at the Dallas airport, where there actually is this really weird mural that's painted on the wall of this very distorted, long-fingered, strange-looking Jesus holding up a plane. Which is this just very surrealistic image. And I had that image early, too, but I didn't know where that was going to come in. I had seen that somewhere, like an airport chapel where you had this really kind of scary-looking Jesus. He didn't look protective. He kind of looked King Kong, like he wrestled the plane out of the sky. It was not a comforting image.
Sure.
And I had that, too, and it ended up going into that chapter. So it's my nonlinear process is the despair, I think, of my agent and publisher, who are kind of like, we'd like to see an outline or a summary or something.
Well, we've got a lot of writers in the room, so let's turn to style matters. You've chosen to write this novel in present tense. How does that, impact your writing process? How does it affect a story, do you think?
I think I like present tense verbs. That's one of the reasons I chose it. I just think, that present tense verbs are strong. They hit me with more punch on the page. And then also, like I said, I wanted to give you the inside of her mind, not after she'd reflected and all this was over and she's safely through whatever's going to happen to her and looking back. But I wanted it to be as close a POV as you could have, almost as like you're looking right over her shoulder, kind of seeing everything as she sees it. And that was kind of in some ways a tough. There's certain scenes that are very tough to write in present tense, so it to some degree dictated scenes that made it in and made it out. But it's probably the POV choices I'm very happy with. I'm very happy with it being first person. I'm very happy with it being present tense.
Do you think the present tense works particularly well in a romantic comedy drama kind of story?
I think what the present tense ideally does is create the reader a little bit of anxiety on behalf of the character. Just a little bit of like, I'm in this moment with them. It strips away even the sense that you're being told a story. And I think makes you a little more melded with the character. So yeah, I do think for certain kinds of stories, it increases your, and it was a deliberate choice because I know that not everybody's crazy about Elise. I did a blog tour. I don't know if do you guys know what a blog tour is?
Explain what a blog tour is for folks.
Things like this, where the writer goes out and talks to people, are becoming slightly less common. One thing that's becoming more common is that, there are a lot of literary bloggers that do reviews online and things like that. And my publisher set up a blog tour for my first week where 8 bloggers a day, each day, would write about the book. And it was really fun, really exciting, because you get in these, kind of online discussions with people. They check in, like this, didn't like that. I think it drives a lot of people to buy the book. I think from a sales technique, it's a smart thing for the publisher to do. It creates a little quick buzz kind of coming out of the chute. And, it also gives you, as the writer, a weird and quick degree of feedback on the book, which I still have sort of a little bit ambivalent. It almost is like, it gives you almost too much feedback on the book sometimes. But it's been interesting, and I thought it was successful enough that I actually want to do another one of them. I actually, I think it's a good way to reach readers, and it's kind of the new, but
talk about cost-effective marketing.
It's totally cost-effective, and that's why they're doing it. I mean, one of the things I hope we get into later is kind of the realities of publishing now. As my fantasy of publishing, which I think was sort of fueled like all English majors from like the 1930s and the whole, Maxwell Perkins is going to be my editor and we're going to have, cocktails and then fling the glass against the fireplace. I think we all kind of grew up on these stories of the fantasy. And the reality of publishing is they're all about now finding cost-effective ways to get the writer out there. And a lot of them require the writer to do a lot of the stuff. I don't think it's the day anymore where you're packaged. It's kind of the day that you self-package. So I hope we'll get to that because I think I didn't know it until I got in it, and I was kind of having to learn as I was going.
I would love to get your perspective on major publishing, particularly fiction publishing, the climate. It seems to me that it is maybe as difficult to sell a novel to a major publisher as it's been as long as I've been following this stuff since the early 90s. Would you agree? It just seems like they're trying to find footing, with new writers. And
Totally. There's so many things right now that nobody knows what's going to happen. I mean, the whole ebook thing, the whole Kindle Nook, nobody knows how that's going to play out. And the writers are kind of, moderately hysterical because we already are getting a small percentage, and now guess what? You're getting a percentage of an even smaller price point. So the writers I don't think the publishers know what it means. Theoretically, people are supposed to read more books under these electronic things, but nobody knows if that's going to actually happen. So there's that huge question mark. I think that most editors right now are very nervous about keeping their jobs. They're almost panic-stricken in the category, the large category. I mean, the largest category I can think of is things I wish I had known 3 years ago about publishing. But one of the ones that has been a tremendous surprise to me is I think everybody's always known your agent is extremely important. I think in the environment you're describing, your relationship with your agent is becoming even more important. It is the central, most important relationship above that with your editor or your publishing house. And I think one of the reasons is because, everyone in publishing is very nervous. Editors are jumping houses. People are losing their job. So the the agent is likely to be the most long-term relationship, the one that's, not going to disappear on you. But there's also the weird reality, which I was not prepared for, which is that you would think that the agent's primary job is to sell the book. And, so the agent is a salesman, and they kind of have the plaid jacket and the carnival barker, step right this way, little lady. that they're the salesperson, and that the editor is the person that's going through the manuscript, you know, arguing with you about where the comma is or all this. My experience, at least, and the experience of some of the other people I know, is that almost the roles are the opposite. I think that agents have become the new gatekeepers for books, and agents, I think, now are doing most of the editing. My agent is a very good editor. That's his background. And he, with my present work, is editing me first. So the agent is now editing, and the editor, I think, has more and more become the person whose job it is to defend the book within the house. Because as these corporate publishers merge, and they're now what maybe used to be 8 houses, it's like one conglomerate, there's a lot of little kind of jockeying for the very limited budget, the very limited attention. And I think your primary function with your editors, it needs to be someone who really believes in your book, who's strong within the house, and who'll try and push your book to the top of the list, to a good place in the catalog, to a place where it gets some marketing budget. So it's strange that, you know, it kind of has flip-flopped. I would have thought the editor was the person you needed to have the emotional, mental, spiritual connection with. And the agent's job was to just, you know, who cares if you like them? Their job is to sell you. It's almost the opposite.
That's interesting. Do you guys have any questions for Kim?
At our last Raleigh Write to Publish, the speaker said you don't necessarily need an agent.
That's true.
Just the exact opposite of what you're indicating, which to me says, and from the things I'm being forced to learn, is this is an industry that doesn't know itself right now. And so his point was that you don't necessarily need an agent because you're going to have to do so much marketing yourself anyway. This agent may be your cheerleader, but you're going to have to do your own marketing.
Just to be perfectly clear too, you know, Kim she's written a novel, and it'll be interesting to hear your answer. John, our last speaker, writes very niche-driven, self-help nonfiction, and he sells them to small publishers. And so in his case, he doesn't really need an agent because he's built up enough contacts. He's sold 7 or 8 nonfiction books about, you know, motivation and leadership and that sort of thing. But would you agree that for fiction you pretty much need an agent? For nonfiction you might be able to get away with
It's totally different. I mean, I said I was a travel writer. For 25 years, the primary source of my income has been a single book, Walt Disney World with Kids, which Fodor's publishes, and I've never had an agent. I mean, for 25 years, that book has been redone, never needed an agent, because you can tell from the title whether or not you want the book. I mean, you're either going to Disney World and you have kids or you don't. So it's not like it's a complicated, I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's not like, oh, you know, it's not like Love in Midair. What does that mean? So, yeah, for nonfiction, no, I agree. You don't need an agent, you know, unless you're trying to be a blockbuster nonfiction, you know, kind of political, you know, on the edge book. But if it's the kind of book people can tell from the title whether or not they want it, no, I agree. I don't think you need an agent, and I think it's, you know, I thrived for 25 years without one. A novel is a whole different kettle of fish. I think it is very hard to publish a novel without an agent, and I shudder to think how many times somebody would have eaten my lunch if I did not have David there. Because, well, like a good example, I trust David implicitly. We have a good working relationship. But like here's the kind of thing that you don't know. When, if you're ever in an enviable position, I'm kind of backing off now, that you've got more than one person wanting to represent you, here's the question you need to ask them. Who do you want to show the book to and why? They need to be able to come up with a sensible answer, because what he was able to do for me when I met him, and I didn't have enough sense to ask that question. I met David, and he became my agent because he was the agent of a friend of mine, which I'm telling this story like I'm telling my novels, which to retract even more is why you need to network.
It's a great story.
But he was the agent for a friend of mine. I stupidly said, I'm not going to use my friends. I'm going to get an agent on my own merit. 3 years later, I'm like, would you introduce me to your agent? For me, the hardest part of the whole process was getting an agent. I tried hard for 3 years to get an agent.
And you had professional writing credits at that point.
It's hard to get an agent. And, you know, I stopped counting at like 40 or 50. I don't even know how many. And Allison introduced me to David McCormick, and we hit it off. He's a really great guy. And he immediately said, this is the first 8 people I'm going to show the book to. If all of them pass on it, this is the second 8. And here's why. She's the editor for blah, 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 and it's similar to your book. She just came out, and for each one, he went through and told me why he thought that would be a good editor for my book or for me. And he had a reason for, each of these 16 people. That was a plausible sounding reason, even to me outside of the industry. I'm like, okay, this makes sense. If so-and-so edited that book and it's similar to mine, yeah, you're right. They might be a good editor for me. And the first 8 all passed on it. And, I just was devastated. The second 8, 3 people bid on it. And of the 3 people that bid on it, I ended up talking to all the editors by phone. And one of the editors I totally hit it off with. I just really totally hit it off with. Another one of the editors was a nice person, but repeatedly used the word regional, which scared me. Every time she said regional, it kind of made a little clink on my ear, because this book is set in the South, but I don't think it's a Southern novel. I mean, I think with very few changes, it could be set pretty much anywhere. And so every time she said regional, I thought, yikes, she's not going to try and go national with it. And then the third person really didn't say anything that was like a deal breaker. So after I talked to them, and I was leaning towards the first editor because we just hit it off personally. We had the same sense of humor. We laughed at the whole conversation. That editor was with Penguin, and they wanted to bring it out in paperback. So I thought, well, what the heck? I buy 95% of my books in trade paperback. Most people do. It's a book club book. So what if it goes straight to paperback? And David was like, and David is not normally the kind of person that just says no. He's very, we're in this together. Everything's collaborative. And he was just like, no, I'm not going to let you, because if you come out in paperback, it could really hurt your foreign rights, and it could really hurt your reviews. Where you're reviewed, a lot of places only review hardback books. And I didn't know that, and he was so right about both of those, because the reviews have been good and they've been very important to me, and I don't think I would have been reviewed in People if I'd not, some of these, next week I'm going to be in USA Today. That wouldn't have happened if I'd come out. And the foreign rights have sold really well. 7 countries have sold, and they sold before the book came out, which was good. I didn't know that by coming out in trade paperback, you might this is the kind of stuff you have no idea, that you need to turn to someone who has no other, motive except to protect you, because how much they make is tied to how much you make. So it's the ultimate, sincere reason to protect you. Just that you can turn to and go, what do I do now? I think sometimes it's hard to have that relationship with your editor, because the editor-author relationship is not adversarial, but if they can get a book for $10,000, they have no incentive to pay you $50,000. They're not telling you, they're not going to say to you, this is what you deserve on the open market. It behooves them to acquire your book as cheaply as possible. So you have a little bit of you're not exactly on the same team at all parts of the negotiation.
A couple of questions here kind of related to it. Let me ask this question first while it's on my mind. One question I have about strategy with agents is related to this question, and hopefully this will be helpful for you guys too, and let's come back and answer your question. How long has David been representing, and is he at an agency that you would characterize as large, medium, or small?
I think his is medium. At the time that my friend, whose book he also represented, brought her book out 10 years ago, and I think she was one of the first major deals he made. So I think he's been an agent for 10 or 12 years. He's got a partner, and it's McCormick Williams, and now they've got 4 or 5 junior agents under them. So now they're like a medium-sized agency, but when I went with him, they were very small. Okay. He comes from an editorial background, which might be one reason why I say he edits a lot of stuff. His background is editorial. He actually worked at the New Yorker.
How long had he been an editor at the New Yorker? Do you know?
That I don't know, but his background was completely editorial, and I think he thinks editorially, but I think more agents are like that now. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of agents are people that used to be on the editorial side, which might be one reason why, like I told you, they're the ones that are doing the preliminary editing now.
There was a question over here. I'm sorry to have interrupted.
Oh, I was just curious on that train of thought, which of the other 2 she went with if she didn't go with the Penguin guy.
I kind of went with the one who didn't self-eliminate, the one that was willing to bring it out in hardback and didn't keep using the word regional. So, it was one of those. It wasn't like there were 20 people vying to get the book. There were 3, so it was not that difficult a thing. But And it's been a good choice. They've done a great job marketing the book, and everything's gone. But to speak to your point, you're flying so blind through so many of these decisions, and they say things to you like the print run's going to be blah blah blah, but you don't know if that's good or bad, or they just throw a number at you, and you're like, okay, and then you call your agent and say, is that good? Because otherwise, how would you know?
I was curious for the marketing stuff. How do you, like after you've picked out your agent and have your publisher and everything, how do the plans for how you're going to market the book evolve? Is it kind of the agent tells you what to do, or do you make it up yourself, or how does it work out?
Another thing I wish I had known. That's such a bulging cat. That file has broken, split, fallen to the floor. I need another hefty bag I can put in things I need to know. You don't have a lot of control over how much money they're going to give you to publicize the book. And that decision is it's made by the publisher, and it's actually made at the time they bid on the book, I suspect. Obviously, if they pay $200,000 for a book, they're going to throw more money at it and protect that investment. They're not going to let a book they paid a lot of money for go down the tubes. If you have been paid that kind of advance, then they've also bought you space on the tables of major chain bookstores. They've also are going to put out ads. They're just prepared to throw more money at that book. If you, on the opposite side of the spectrum, got more like a $10,000 advance, you're going to be more on your own. They're going to be going more towards internet things. They just don't have as many. If you